Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, where we explore all aspects of ending relationships, separation, and parenting apart. If your marriage or partnership has ended, or you have friends and family who are separating, this podcast is for you. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor, divorce specialist, and co-founder of Amicable, the online legal service for separating couples. In each episode, we look at relationships and separation from different angles, including the emotional, legal, and social. I'm joined by experts and special guests who share their own unique stories, experience, and tips, with the goal of helping people end relationships in a kinder and better way. Today, we're talking about what a good divorce can really look like with Sarah Madden Armstrong, Vice President of Global Marketing Operations at Google and author of The Mum's Guide to a Good Divorce. She shares her own separation story and how she approached co-parenting with kindness and intention. We cover practical tips for small everyday moments that matter, from family photos to parent-teacher meetings, and how to balance career, childcare, and divorce. Plus, thoughtful advice on making space for self-care while navigating this big life transition. If you loved this episode, then please subscribe and rate us on your preferred listening platform. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Kate. So great to be with you today.
It's lovely to have you. And if anybody should be on this podcast, clearly with that background, it should be you. I mean, good grief. A proponent of a good divorce, that's what we like to hear at Amicable. And it's something we believe in absolutely as well. And it is, as you say, something that society needs to get on board with, and we need to change this narrative. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about your journey and your kind of activism so far. Why don't we start with a little bit of background then? Tell us your separation story. What got you into this space in the first place?
Yes. So, I like to start, Kate, by saying first, I'm not an advocate for the concept of divorce. I think if couples can be married and stay married for long term, that's wonderful. And that's the path I thought I was on. My parents had been married for 57 years. And so I had this amazing model in my house growing up. But unfortunately, we got to a point where my husband and I decided we were no longer going to be together. My daughter was 7 at the time. And so we decided, because I had seen, even though my parents were happily married, I'd seen some very ugly divorces growing up and things that really stuck in my head. And so when we decided we were going down this path, I said, I want to do it a different way than the way that I'd seen other couples do it in my childhood. And so I didn't know what that looked like, by the way. But I thought, I just want to really think very consciously about this. So through the process, we made very conscious choices, but we always put our daughter Grace first through the whole entire process. And if you fast forward, we went through a divorce, we got through it. In the years following my divorce, I had a number of girlfriends who would come to me and say, I'm thinking about this. And I'd say, well, I'm not looking to talk you into anything. They said, no, but I'd love to go through the process the way you did because you had such a good divorce. And so I would help them and just kind of give them these coaching tips and guidance along the way. And what was interesting is it was actually Grace at age 8, a year after we got divorced. We're standing at a checkout line and there's a celebrity couple on the newsstand on a magazine. And they're getting a divorce. And Grace said to me, Mommy, is that a good divorce or a bad divorce?
Oh, wow.
And
Wow.
I said, Grace, I don't know. What's the difference between a good divorce and a bad divorce? She said, well, good divorce is when the mommy and daddy are nice to each other like you and daddy. And a bad divorce is when they scream and yell at each other.
Oh, out of the mouth of babes.
Absolutely, Kate. And I stopped for a second and I thought, and I first said to her, well, it's hard to tell from a magazine cover what type of divorce that is. But as we walked out of that drugstore, Kate, I thought, whatever my ex-husband and I were doing, the fact that Grace at age 8, a year after we had literally changed her life so significantly, could say that we had a good divorce, I knew that we were onto something. And so going back to my girlfriends, that was what they had been observing as the approach we'd taken. And so it led me on a path of eventually writing this book, which was, an interesting thing because I was at a business dinner in Mexico City with a friend and colleague, and he turned to me and he said, Sarah, you're so happy. And I said, yeah. He said, but you're divorced. and I said, Selman, getting a divorce is not a death sentence. I said, I'm happy. Grace is happy. My ex-husband's happy. Like, you can be divorced and be happy. That's possible. And I mentioned him, my friends had been encouraging me to write down all this guidance that I had been giving them over the years. And he said, you really should. So I got on the plane out of Mexico City that next morning and I opened up my personal laptop and I started writing. And I wrote a large majority of The Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce flying around the world for my job. But yeah, but what it was is just all these bite-sized pieces of guidance that I feel help a mom that's going through this process that you never plan for, by the way, right? I mean, you when you grow up, you're thinking about your wedding and all those things. You're not thinking, so when I get a divorce, these are the things we're going to do. So I felt really compelled to share what would help other moms through this.
That's an amazing story. I love that. I love that it was your daughter Grace who kind of nailed it essentially, didn't she? And like you say, it's all of the things that you've been doing, but to actually codify that into like almost a guide, well, it is a guide,
This
isn't it?
guide, yeah,
Is
it is.
something else. I guess I want to pick up. I want to dig into
Yeah.
what this advice is, obviously, because this is the divorce podcast, and people listening will want to understand and know that in more detail. But just before we do that, the point you made right at the very beginning is an important one, and sometimes this all gets conflagrated, doesn't it? And therefore, it becomes quite tricky to talk about it. But as you say, there is a big difference between, you know, promoting divorce as a lifestyle choice, which none of us are doing, versus trying to make it as good as it can be once that decision has been made. And that sort of sniper's alley of which side of the line you're on and how you negotiate that with how you talk about what you do, I think is a very tricky and delicate balance. How have you navigated that? Because you started really strong with that, and I'm interested in that as a sort of concept.
No, it's great, Kate. So first, I start with the thought that first of all, no one gets married to get divorced, right? As I mentioned, you don't plan this. And generally the reason for the divorce isn't something positive. It's something that you've had to arrive to. But children, at the end of the day, children don't get to decide that their parents are going to get divorced, but they're the ones that are so significantly impacted. But I do think that parents that bring children in the world, you bring your children in the world and you want to raise them in the healthiest, happiest, safest environment possible. That's the whole goal. I joke that we cover the plugs and we feed them organic milk, right? We put bike helmets on them. We do all these things to keep them healthy and happy. But then when a divorce becomes a reality in a child's life, and depending on how the parents have chosen to approach the divorce, you can put your child in a very toxic situation. And for days, for months, for weeks, for years. And I think we owe it to our children. Just because we decided not to live in the same house together doesn't mean that we should have our children living in a negative, with like a negative dark cloud following them their whole lives. I just don't think that has to be the case. And I also think, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I think that society still wants, if you've gone through divorce, they want you to a bit wear a scarlet letter. Like it's this label, right? You were divorced. And I think the other thing I'd love to change is a societal perception. If 50% of marriages in the US at least are going to end in divorce, why wouldn't we want them to be good? I mean, the reason you go through divorce is to be happy at the end of the day. And I think that that's one of the things that sometimes I think there's the label that's attached to it. And then there's this perception that you're supposed to have this negativity that follows you and your children. And I just fundamentally don't believe that has to be the case.
Hello, my lovely listeners. I hope you're finding this episode helpful and comforting. I just wanted to take a moment to share some news. I've written a book and it's called Amicable Divorce. It's a practical guide to separating with dignity, supporting your children and navigating finances and co-parenting without unnecessary conflict. It's all the guidance you can usually find on the podcast and much more. If that sounds helpful, you can pre-order it today on Amazon. Thanks so much, and now let's get back to the show. I think there's an element of wanting to punish. I don't know whether that's left over from the sort of religious connotations of marriage and it being a taboo subject and you not being allowed to divorce and the church not recognizing it for such a long time. And this concept of it being seen as a failure. as opposed to a positive choice to make the lives of all the individuals involved better, which to me is what it is ultimately. You're looking at a situation and say, okay, this isn't working, and therefore how do we turn what's become a negative into a positive? Well, we need to go our separate ways and create a life where we can still be involved in our children's lives and we can live in two separate households. You don't stop being a family necessarily. You just stop living in the traditional way a family has lived up to that point. You just change the way you live rather than what you are. And for me, I kind of hold on to that. But
No,
yeah, I'm not
I've
sure.
I've I've fundamentally held on to that, and actually, that was one of the kind of principles of how we approached our divorce with Grace. I mean, we did live in separate homes, and one of the poignant moments for me, Kate, on our journey was in the very early days, right before we were going to tell Grace that we were going to get a divorce. We had gone to see a child specialist that she was going to see after we told her, and we sat down with him, and he looks at me and he goes, "Sarah, do you travel for your job?" And I said, "Yeah, I travel globally." And he looks at my ex-husband and he says, "Do you travel?" And he says, "Well, yeah, I travel domestically." He said, "Well, Grace is about to become a professional traveler. She's going to travel every week for the next 11 years back and forth between your homes, and she's going to have to pack a bag." And I burst into tears, Kate, because I thought that's not what I wanted for her. That I didn't want her to feel like this professional. I knew what it felt like to be a professional traveler. I do that a lot. I thought, I don't want that. I don't want her packing a bag every week. So I walked out of that session. I looked at my soon to be ex-husband and said, "I don't know what this looks like, but I want to figure out how Grace doesn't feel like a professional traveler every week." And so what that looked like for us, and again, some of these things have some socioeconomic considerations, but I said, I want to put all the basics at both homes. So when Grace walks out the door by the way, she was in first grade when we got divorced. She's a little one, and she was the first of her friends for her parents to have gone through
Yeah,
divorce,
same with my kids. They were the
right?
first, and
They were the
that's kind
first.
of because you're sort of setting the scene then, aren't you?
Yes, yeah, and so I didn't want her to be the one child in carpool line with an extra bag, with people going, "Why do you have that bag?" "Well, I have to go to my mom's house or my dad's house." So what we tried to do is to have the basics at both homes. So when Grace walked out the door from whichever home in the morning to go to school, she just had her backpack. She wasn't carrying that extra bag. And, it's a small thing, but actually, if you think about 11 years and the period of time that is, it is something that's a day-to-day reality for children of divorce. And how do you minimize those feelings of being different and having to live in a different way than all of your friends? And so now I do joke, and I don't know how all the socks got at one house, Kate. There was always, I would joke that we would have to have what I called rebalancing days because
Yeah,
somehow
yeah,
things always got a
yeah,
little bit of
yeah,
out of balance. But the important thing there is when things got out of balance, it wasn't Grace's job to rebalance her clothing across two households. That was our job. So even, I'd text my ex-husband and say, "Hey, I don't have any socks over here, or I don't have any shorts." So he would go through and figure out what was extra, put it in a bag. And when we did our drop off, he would hand it to me. And then I would take it up and put it in Grace's,
yeah.
dresser
So
and
she doesn't
closet.
see it or feel
Well,
it.
she does.
Yeah,
Again, it's not like, "Hey, Grace, go put your extra clothes away." It's like, no, that's not her. I guess she's 8, she's 9. I mean, she should just be a kid. She should just be able to come and go. So I think a little bit of is these moments and these actions that we can take, and just thinking a little bit in a different way than I think, you would in a normal, I say normal, in a two-parent
traditional.
household.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
I guess for me, when I'm listening to you sort of explaining that and where we started with that conversation, there's this kind of societal desire, isn't there, still to want to almost punish or see it as a negative. Then there's the group of people who are probably listening and people like us for whom this is just such a no-brainer. Why would you have anything other than the most positive divorce you could possibly have? And there's a mismatch, isn't there, between the reality of people going through it who are trying their hardest to do things in a positive way. There's then this kind of societal punishment thing and the guilt that that brings and the shame that that brings for people. But if we park that for a moment and say, right, as this positive group of people who are trying to do this in a different way, do we have a collective view? So forget the outliers, the society bits, the people who don't get it. We'll part those from a minute. But do we have a collective view of what a good divorce is?
I personally think a good divorce is when two parents set aside their emotions about each other and they put their children first in both their actions and how they talk and how they respond in moments. And if you can do that, again, what I'm saying, Kate, I realize it's not easy, right? If we have that as a foundational, like that's what a good divorce looks like. If it sometimes, and I say, you have to take the high road, and the high road can be steep. It can be really steep, but I think it's so important for the benefit of our children that we are doing that, that we're taking the high road and we're, thinking about them first, and then we can figure out and it's not that we shouldn't do what's best for us is like from a mental health and wellness standpoint, but I think putting our children first in these moments is really important.
So I don't think anyone would disagree with that sentiment. I think you're right. I think we can agree that there is such a thing as a good divorce. It does require you to put your children before yourselves. It does require you to damp down any residual feelings of anger and upset and frustration that you feel with your ex. How do you do that?
Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so here's the key part. Now, I'll give you two things that I think is fundamental. First of all, I think we all need in our lives or is a compartmentalization muscle. Okay, I joke that I do Pilates, that they talk to you about having a strong core muscle. I think we all need a compartmentalization muscle, and the reason that's important is when we talk about the emotions of divorce, it is an emotional roller coaster, right? And not even just during, not even preparing during, but post. I mean, there are things that are going to trigger you. The question is, when those buttons are pushed or when those triggers happen, do you react in the moment? If your children are around, my strong belief is that you should not react in the moment. You should let that moment pass. Then you can go talk to a friend, talk to a therapist, go for a walk, whatever it is. Just don't do it with your children. Your children see and hear everything and they take in everything. And so I didn't ever want Grace to be around any of that negativity, but I think that you have to build that muscle. Most people don't have it, right? But in the moment when that happens, you have to take a deep breath and say, okay, this could be one of those moments, but I'm going to let it pass. And it's not about by the way, stuffing the emotions inside, because that's not healthy either, but it is about trying to express them at a different point with the appropriate audience for your emotions. And even if it's by yourself, but just not with your kids there. I think that's first. And I realize, by the way, that's easier said than done. The other is, if you think about to your point, the way society perceives a divorced couple and how you're supposed to show up or not show up for your children, I think that's one of the things that you get to set the tone of what that looks like. Right. And now there are instances where people, because of very specific circumstances, they can't be in each other's presence, like physical presence. And I appreciate that that's a very specific subset of the divorce population. But for most instances, you should be able to be in the same room or on the same side of a soccer field or at a school play. And, when your children are out in the world, and if both of their parents are there, they shouldn't have to look at two different sides of the field to see their parents if something went well. They should be able to look at least one side and maybe even one area and see both of their parents saying, great job, that was awesome. And I think, again, these are the things that we, as from a societal standpoint, think people should be, not sitting together or not approaching things in a unified way for your child. And the again, moment that we had as a couple and with Grace is we went to Grace's parent-teacher conference when she was in 6th grade. Okay, so at her school at that age, the child goes with the parents in to talk about how they're doing. So we walk in, we sit down, we talk about Grace's school, details for an hour. At the end of the hour, the teacher looks at us and she's like, wait a minute, are you two divorced? And I said, well, yeah, we've been divorced for 5 years. She said, I had no idea. I looked at her and said, well, it didn't occur to me to walk in here and say, hi, we're
Yeah.
divorced.
Yeah.
Can we talk about how Grace is doing in 6th grade? And she said to me, you wouldn't believe how few parents can walk into this office and sit down together with their child for an hour and talk about their child's education. It is very, very rare. And she goes, and it makes me really sad. And I said, that makes me really sad too. What's more important to a parent besides their child's health? How their child is doing in school. And by the way, Grace is here in this whole conversation. But, it's just another example of where we put up these perceptions of how you're supposed to act in a divorce situation. And I think we have to change all of that.
It sounds like some of what you're saying is it's kind of almost like we set expectation and people are sort of self-fulfilling then, aren't they? It's becoming a
Absolutely.
self-fulfilling prophecy that
Absolutely.
this is the negative,
Yeah.
description of a divorce. This is what it looks like. Therefore, people sort of stumble through without
Yeah.
really questioning. But
Absolutely.
also, isn't there something, and I'm playing devil's advocate a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah,
here,
please.
but isn't there something also that says you must have certain skills or a certain personality type if a teacher recognizes you are unusual, you and your ex-husband? So what is it either about your relationship or your personality or your skill set that allows you to bring what so many other people, I include myself in the so many other people, haven't been able to and can't?
I think I do think it goes back a bit to what I mentioned earlier in terms of that compartmentalization muscle. I think it goes back to when we started on this divorce journey, to call it that, my goal of positive intent for everything in Grace's life was like front and center. And I thought if because she didn't choose this, Kate, right? Your kids didn't choose, she didn't choose to live this way. And I thought, well, then that's on me and that's on my ex-husband to figure out how she doesn't years from now, lament the fact, oh, my parents got divorced. I mean, yes, it's a factor in her life. It happened. It's an action, but I didn't want it to be the defining, element of her childhood. I felt so strongly about that was something, that I just think in everything that we did across over the years, that was really just front and center to me, and I mean, even another example, but one that I think really resonates for people is Grace and I stayed in the family home after the divorce. Okay. So that was the decision. And my ex-husband moved to a place less than 10 minutes away. But before he moved, one of the things that I think we underestimate with our kids going through divorce is the pulling apart of the family home and what that can do to them, mentally, and also just the physical kind of manifestation of that. And so, we were divvying up things and he was taking things and I was keeping things, but we actually had this long hallway of family photos. They were black and white photos from both of our families. It was this beautiful montage that I'd put together years before and they were all framed, but I needed to give my ex-husband his family photos. And so this is one of those moments where I'm like, this is going to take time and I don't really have the time for this. But I went and found other photos that I wanted to frame and got framed. And on a Saturday, I sent Grace down the street for a play date. She's 7. That's what you do at age 7. So I sent her down the street and I took out this box. I took down the photos of my ex-husband. I put new ones up. I put everything away. Grace came home about 2 hours later. And she walks in the house and I'm in the kitchen and I hear this little voice from the hallway say, "Hey, Mom." And I go, "What's that, Grace?" She says, "The wall has changed." And I stop in my tracks. And I said, "Well, what's changed?" She said, "There are more pictures of me up there. It looks great." And she ran up to her room.
Love it.
And Kate, I can tell you, I was frozen in my
Oh, I
tracks.
bet you were.
And
I could feel the icy chill running down my back as you were saying that. Oh my God.
and you know what? I took a deep breath and I thought, you know what? Here's the deal though. If I had only taken the first step, which is to take the photos off the wall, put them in a box and give them to my ex-husband and left all those little hangers interspersed on the wall. And Grace had come home and that's what she had seen. She would be telling a therapist years later, my parents got a divorce. My mom took all the photos of my dad off the wall and she left those little hangers. That's the reality. So I use this as an example because it took effort. It was not something I wanted to have to do. It's all those things, but I didn't want that to be her memory. I didn't. Now in her bedroom, we love photos. So there were photos of both sides of her family in her bedroom. Those stayed, Kate, until we moved out of that house when she was 18 years old. Like that's her family and that's her bedroom. So I would walk in every night to kiss her goodnight, and there's my ex-husband, his parents, his brother, they're all there. But you know what? That's her room. That's her family. It's not for me to take, to wipe him, you know, out of the house.
Erase him. Yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but I guess I just use this as an example. So when you ask, what is it? I just really was wanting to look ahead. And I have seen so many of my friends who have parents that are divorced, and I know the impact that's had on them over the course of time and the impact it has on your views on relationships and on marriage. And I just wanted to at least give Grace everything she could to come out of this and not feel like that was going to be the defining factor of how she approached the rest of her life.
When you're talking about, setting up these co-parenting rules, if you like, or the way that you've organized logistics, how did that start? Because a lot of the time, money and children get all mixed in, don't they? And sometimes if the money conversations don't go very well, it leaks into the children. So did you start with Grace and work the money out afterwards? Or did you start with the finances? Or did that bear any relevance to how well you were able to establish a positive co-parenting relationship?
It's a great question. We were jointly funding her life. So that was a decision we made, and we both worked. So it was very much a joint situation, which I know is not always the case. But I wouldn't say it was kind of in parallel, but we knew we went through, in fairness, we went through a collaborative divorce process, which is something that in the US is becoming more common, where there's basically two coaches that coach each of you through the decisions you need to make about your children. Then the lawyers basically write up those decisions. They're not involved until the very end of the process. But with that, so we put together a parenting plan. And I think for us, the parenting plan was the guide, because that had all of those. So it's all the decisions you need to make, all the discussions you need to have about your child from the point you're getting divorced through the time they're going to most likely go off to college, or age 18, basically. And you're having to think much further ahead than you would normally need to in a parenting moment or a parenting. But I actually think it allowed us to put that in place at a point when we're like, okay, what's best for Grace sitting here now? And we could always revisit it if we needed to, but it was our guide throughout. It was, how were we going to fund college? Were we going to buy her a car or not? All of these things you're deciding up front, so that you don't have those debates down the road when there potentially are other voices in the mix with you.
Involved. Well,
Uh-huh.
I just think
Yeah.
that's so important, because so often people think, I think particularly in this country, that a parenting plan is just working out where the child's going to be at any given moment. So how many nights am I having versus how, and so a lot of people come to us and say, oh, we sorted that. We don't need to talk about it. But it's all the stuff around it. And when there's nobody else involved, it's so much easier, because the minute you've got blended family and you've got other people's expectations and their kind of family traditions or anything else coming into it, it starts to muddy the water and your voice gets diluted. So if you've got the chance to think through all of these things when you're not in the moment, like even stuff like how you introduce new partners, it's a way different conversation if we're talking about it in the abstract versus I've shacked up with somebody and I am desperate to introduce them because that makes my life easier. And I really want my child to get, quite comfortable so that we've got our own little life going on. So different to just then thinking about, okay, let's think about this when there isn't that pressure on. What genuinely is best for the child here, and how would we want to involve each other in that?
Absolutely. And that's where, quite honestly, that's why I wrote the book the way that I did. It is literally bite-sized pieces. It's a topic per page, and it's taking that point, whatever that topic is, and saying, just think about this for a moment. And there are so many things to think about when you're raising children across two households, and so many dynamics, specifically in the divorce era, in the divorce phase of this, that you really need to think through. And so I do think people think once they land the schedule, they're done. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's just the beginning. It is just the beginning, but it is doable. And I think that's the thing, Kate, is, I want everyone to know that what we're talking about, it takes effort, but it's doable. And it's also one of the best things you can do for your children, is to think about how you're approaching this. And I look back, and Grace is now, in fairness, Grace is 23. So she's out in the world. She just started her first job this last week. We're very excited. But what's interesting is she was at an age when I published my book. She was 12 when I published it, and I had her read it before because I said, this is about how we've gone through this. And I want to make sure you're comfortable with it. And she read it. She goes, Mom, this is really going to help a lot of families. And I said, that's the goal, is because I want them to know, I want families to know, and I want moms to know that there is a way to do this where you can be happy on the other side. And that you can be happy, your children can be happy. Hopefully you can have a healthy co-parenting relationship with your ex-spouse. That is all possible, but it does take some very conscious effort. And I think that's the thing that everyone needs to focus on.
Brilliant. Sarah, you mentioned just then that you were both working. How much did working help or hinder your ability to get a decent co-parenting relationship? And ultimately, did the divorce impact your career, do you think?
Great questions. On the first one, for me, I've always loved working, and Grace knows that. Everyone that knows me knows that I love doing both. So I think my work was always both a wonderful support for what I was doing and allowed me to do what I needed to do, but also was a great outlet for me in terms of having another thing to focus on during the divorce. In terms of it hurting my career, I would say no. I did, in fairness though, I did pass up a promotion that came my way during my divorce because I wasn't in the right mindset and I wasn't in the right space to take on something new. And I said that very frankly. They wanted me to take something. I said, I can't do that right now. I said, I am about to become a single working mom. And I didn't ever plan to be a single working mom. And I don't know what this looks like. I don't know what this entails. So thank you for the vote of confidence on this new role, but now's not the time. And so maybe at that moment, there was a pause on my career from that standpoint, but that wasn't what was important to me at the moment. And it was, the right decision. I would make that decision every time if given that decision because of all that I was trying to juggle. So no, I'd say everyone's different in terms of how they feel both about their careers and their jobs, but also how how they go through the divorce process. And I think I just had decided that, I wanted to make sure that first and foremost, Grace was going to be, you know, in the best position possible to get through this. And then I really did focus on my career and I focused on my friendships because I knew I would really need those during and after as well for support. And so that was also really important.
It sounds like balancing being a working single mum requires you to have a good network of people around you. To what extent did you use people around you? How did you cope with suddenly, all the additional mental headspace, the organization, everything else that comes with being a single working mum?
Yeah, no, I do talk about you really need to build your support network, and your support network is a combination of things. It can be other working moms that just appreciate the juggling you're trying to do, right? And just they get that. But also, I think the stay at home moms or stay at home parents, I should say, who are at home and may have a different level of flexibility to help you in those moments when you need help. And I really had a wonderful balance of friends that were both working and stay at home. And depending on what the thing was, I would, lean on people. And my parents, actually, my family lives across the country. We were in Atlanta at the time and my parent was in California. So, I didn't have family support, in place. So one thing, again, appreciate the socioeconomic consideration, but we did have a nanny that, managed between the two homes. So we always jointly hired, my ex-husband and I.
Oh, okay.
And
Interesting. Yep.
yes, yeah. And so we wanted one person that was consistent in helping us to also raise Grace. And because we both traveled, we needed that. There would be times when both of us might be out of town and we needed someone to stay over. So, but it does take, I say, it takes a full, network of, it takes a village, as they say, but it takes a network of people that you really trust, that you can lean on in those moments. And I definitely had that. And I can't imagine having gone through it without those friends.
Mm. And it's interesting because right at the beginning you were saying, Grace was the first in her cohort. And I can remember, my kids being the first in their cohort. And I felt desperate to find other single parents so that you could at least normalize what you were going through. So you weren't the only one in the class. So we had to find different groups and things we could go and do where we could find other single parents. So it would just feel more normal to them.
I understand. And yeah, I do call it the new normal, after divorce, you're trying to get that new normal. And I did have, again, a couple of girlfriends with children Grace's age that went through it around the same time. And you form new traditions, you do different things when you're in that situation. And I agree that there is some element of finding those people that are in a similar situation and seeing how you can forge different types of friendships because of it.
In just a moment, Sarah's going to share her top tips on balancing parenthood, work, and self care post divorce, and you wouldn't want to miss it. But before that, if this episode has given you a little bit of clarity or comfort, or just a tip that's made things feel a bit more manageable, make sure to follow the Divorce Podcast on your favourite podcast app. Each week, we're here with expert advice and real support to help you through separation one step at a time. Okay, Sarah, final tips then. What would your top advice be for balancing parenthood, work, and self care post divorce?
It's interesting, but a couple things. One is you do need to take care of yourself through all of this. And I think it's not something we've talked about yet. And, the only way that you can be strong enough to go through this process is to take care of yourself. And I liken it actually, ironically, to pregnancy, because when you go through pregnancy, you're getting your sleep, you're eating well, you're working out, you're doing whatever it is that makes you feel as good as you can. Divorce is the same thing. You have to really spend some time thinking, what do you need right now? Because you are emotionally being depleted every day, right? But what are the things you can physically do to help with that? And so I think self-care is so important as you're preparing for going through in post-divorce. And a lot of times, because we are who we are as women, sometimes we put ourselves last. A lot of times we put ourselves last. And I think in these moments, that's one thing that we have to think about is what is it that you need so that you can get up the next day and do this. And, I talk about that the first year post-divorce, it's like you're getting over a divorce hangover, but you still have to drive carpool every morning, right?
Yeah.
You still have to get up, you still have to do it. And so, what is it that you need to do so that just that fog that you're in, that you really are in that first year, that how does that clear out as quickly as possible? Because you do feel like you're trying to kind of navigate in ways that are really hard. And I think self-care is one of the pieces of that puzzle that is really important. The other thing that I'd say that we haven't fully touched on is just being organized. And you mentioned it earlier, but the more organized you can be as you go through this, the less harried you feel, in these moments of now being a single working parent. And it's hard because there are so many balls you're juggling. But I think that is something that if that's not your strong suit, then figuring out, how to be a bit more organized. If it is your strong suit, it's going to help you. But I do think that that's a key part as well. That really is probably kind of one of those foundational elements as you're trying to manage everything that's now in your day-to-day world. And then my final thought is on the work front, I think just deciding how much you need to share about your divorce or not. Those that needed to know knew that I was going through a divorce. Others, I didn't broadcast it because I just didn't think it was relevant to my day-to-day of doing my job. I actually had one colleague who I worked relatively closely with. It wasn't until 8 months after my divorce that she understood that I was divorced. She goes, I had no idea. I said, you know what? It wasn't, it's something I'm going through, but I just didn't feel the need to be, yelling it from the rooftops. So I think that's another just choice you make of how much you share and in those that you need to tell so that they can support you. But does everyone need to know everything about what's going on in your personal life? I think that's a choice.
Yeah, that's an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because I think people potentially treat you differently. And therefore, and I always say this to parents about the school, don't rush off to tell the school that this is what's happening, because then every time your child does anything, it gets attributed to the fact that you're divorcing, even if it's just normal childhood behavior. You're the one with the spotlight on you. And I just kind of think sometimes, actually, no, you know it. You can get the school to keep an eye on your child in more subtle ways than that. And sometimes I think it's much better not to. And when it's the thing you lead with every conversation, and then people wonder why they're not going out as much or people aren't dating them or whatever. It's because if you open with, I'm divorced and do you want to hear my story? It becomes very boring very quickly, doesn't it?
Yeah. And you know what, Kate, I think that's a really important point. And one of the things that I say on this topic is, divorce is an action. You got divorced. Okay. You have to decide if you want that to define the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I didn't want it to define the rest of my life. Ironically, I wrote a book on the topic, but that wasn't, that was for giving back. But, and I've had people, funnily enough, that say I make divorce look too good.
What does that
And
mean?
and I said,
That's code for there are a lot of people in a lot of unhappy relationships, and you might start a trend. People might start to say, actually, you know what? I want more than this.
well, and you know what? I mean, my response when that person said it to me is, you know what? I'm just trying to live the happiest life possible.
Yeah.
And that's why, that's the whole goal when you go through this change is to be happier. And so unapologetically, if that's the reality, okay, I guess. I mean, but it's interesting that was something that was literally said to me in conversation. And I had to stop and go, well, I'm just trying to be happy.
Brilliant. Well, look, this has been such an interesting conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining me. Where can people find out more about you, Sarah?
Yeah. So the best way to reach me is I have a website and it's gooddivorce.guide. And all my contact information is there, information about the Mom's Guide to a Good Divorce. The book is available on Amazon. It's in a paperback. It's also available in an ebook. And I went into the studio and there's an audiobook version as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, so whichever format you need, but it's a bite-sized guide. It's not meant to be read cover to cover. It's meant to be there for
Yeah.
you
Dip in,
along the
dip
journey.
out.
Yeah, dip in,
Yeah.
dip out, and you can look at one topic or, a couple topics, but it's hopefully helpful. And that's the whole goal.
That's fantastic. Well, we'll definitely put that in the show notes. Of course, you can find me on LinkedIn on the divorcepodcast.com, or you can find us on your favorite listening platforms. And don't forget, we'd love to hear any of your questions or any inspiration for other topics or other guests. So please do get in touch at hello@amicable.co.uk. Thank you very much for joining me indeed, Sarah. It's been an absolute treat talking to you. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks so much, Kate.